The gunshot that killed Ophelia Preston's husband echoed through the dusty streets of Florissant, Colorado. But she couldn't bring herself to scream because all she felt was relief. It was August 1878, and the summer heat had turned the small mountain town into a furnace where secrets simmered and truth burned hotter than the midday sun. She stood on the wooden porch of the general store, her fingers clutching a bag of flour so tightly that white powder dusted her black mourning dress. And she watched as Marshal Dixon examined the body of Silas Preston sprawled in the dirt outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. Owen Calloway had been sitting on his horse at the edge of town when he heard the shot. He'd been coming into Florissant for supplies, his cattle drive having ended successfully in Denver 3 weeks prior, and he'd decided to spend some time in the high country before heading back to his ranch near Colorado Springs. His chestnut mare had shifted nervously beneath him as the sound ricocheted off the surrounding peaks, but Owen had steadied her with a gentle hand. He'd known Silas Preston by reputation, and that reputation was darker than coal dust. Now, as he rode slowly toward the commotion, he saw the widow standing on that porch, and something in the way she held herself, rigid and trembling simultaneously, made him pull his horse to a stop. Ophelia had married Silas 5 years ago when she was only 18, fresh off the wagon train from Missouri with her parents who died of fever within the first winter. Silas had been 35, a successful mine owner with a big house and bigger promises. Her parents' friends had encouraged the match, said she needed security, said she was lucky a man of means had taken interest. What they hadn't known, what nobody had known until it was too late, was that Silas Preston's hands were as hard as the rocks he pulled from the earth, and his temper was more unpredictable than a summer storm in the Rockies. The marshal was calling for witnesses, and Ophelia forced her feet to move down the steps. Her legs felt like they were made of the same pine that built this town, stiff and unyielding. She'd been married to a monster, but the law didn't care about bruises hidden under long sleeves or the way a woman learned to move silently through her own home to avoid waking a drunk husband. The law cared about facts, about who pulled the trigger, about justice that looked nothing like freedom. Owen dismounted and led his horse to the hitching post outside the general store. He was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of the Colorado sky before a storm. He'd seen Ophelia Preston around town before, always moving quickly, always looking over her shoulder, always alone despite being married. He'd wanted to speak to her, wanted to ask if she was all right, but a man didn't interfere in another man's marriage, not in 1878. Not without causing more trouble than help. The shooter turned out to be a drifter named Jack Carmichael, a gambler who claimed Silas had cheated him at cards and pulled a knife first. 3 witnesses confirmed it, including the bartender and 2 miners who'd been drinking away their wages. Self-defense, clear as mountain water. The marshal arrested Carmichael anyway, said there'd need to be a hearing, said everyone should go home and let the law handle things proper. Ophelia walked back to the house she'd shared with Silas, that big empty house on the hill that overlooked the town like a judge on a bench. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the doorknob. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it that morning. The kitchen clean, the floors swept, the windows open to let in whatever breeze might find its way through the peaks. She set the flour on the counter and then her knees gave out. She sank to the floor and pressed her hands to her face, but still she couldn't cry. 5 years of tears had dried up somewhere along the way, leaving her hollow as a rotted tree trunk. Owen didn't go home that night. He took a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Templeton, a kind widow who made the best biscuits in 3 counties. He told himself he needed to testify at the hearing since he'd been in town when the shooting happened, but the truth was more complicated. The truth was he couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the porch, about the way she'd looked like she might shatter into 1,000 pieces if anyone touched her. The hearing took place 2 days later in the town hall, a small building that also served as a church on Sundays and a school during the week. Judge Harrison presided, a stern man with white whiskers and a no-nonsense approach to frontier justice. Ophelia sat in the front row wearing the same black dress, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. Owen sat 3 rows behind her, his hat in his hands, watching the back of her neck and wondering why it seemed so fragile. Jack Carmichael told his story with the ease of a man who'd told many stories before. Silas had accused him of cheating, which was rich considering everyone in Florissant knew Silas Preston cheated at everything from cards to business deals to marriage vows. Carmichael said Silas had come at him with a knife, said he'd drawn his gun in defense, said it was a clean shoot. The witnesses backed him up. The judge deliberated for less than an hour before declaring it justifiable homicide. Carmichael was free to go, though the marshal suggested he might want to leave town sooner rather than later. After the hearing, Ophelia stood outside the town hall, blinking in the bright sunlight like a creature emerging from a cave. People walked past her, some offering condolences that sounded hollow, others avoiding her eyes altogether. She was a widow now, which meant she was both pitiable and slightly dangerous in the way that unmarried women were always considered dangerous in small towns. She'd inherit Silas's property, his mine shares, his money. She'd be one of the wealthiest people in Florissant, and she'd also be utterly alone. Owen approached her carefully, the way he'd approach a skittish horse. "Mrs. Preston," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I'm Owen Calloway. I own a ranch down near Colorado Springs. I just wanted to say if you need anything, any help with arrangements or paperwork or such, I'd be happy to assist." Ophelia looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time. His eyes were kind, which startled her. She'd forgotten men could have kind eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, rusty from disuse. "That's very generous, but I'll manage." "I'm sure you will," Owen said, "but the offer stands just the same." He put his hat back on and tipped it to her, then walked away before she could say anything else. He didn't want to crowd her, didn't want to be another man telling her what to do or how to feel. He just wanted her to know she wasn't completely alone in the world, even if she felt like it. The funeral was held the next day at the cemetery on the edge of town, where the graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, and the view stretched all the way to Pike's Peak on clear days. Reverend Matthews said words about ashes and dust and eternal rest, but Ophelia didn't hear them. She stood beside the pine coffin and thought about all the nights she'd lain awake planning escape routes that never materialized. She thought about the time she'd saved enough money to buy a stagecoach ticket to Denver, only to have Silas find it and beat her so badly she couldn't walk for a week. She thought about the slowly dying hope that anyone would ever help her, that anyone would ever see what was happening behind the closed doors of that big house on the hill. Owen attended the funeral along with what seemed like half the town. Some came out of respect, others out of curiosity, a few out of genuine grief for a man who'd employed them or loaned them money. Owen came because he couldn't stay away. He watched Ophelia stand there like a statue carved from pale marble, and he wanted to tell her that it was all right to be relieved. That survival wasn't something to be ashamed of. That freedom was worth whatever guilt might come with it. After the funeral, People gathered at the house for food and drink, as was custom. Ophelia moved through the rooms like a ghost, accepting condolences and half-meant offers of help. The mine foreman, a burly man named Tucker, asked about her plans for the mining operation. The bank manager, Mr. Whitmore, mentioned she'd need to come by to sort out accounts and deeds. The mayor's wife suggested she might want to leave Florissant, start fresh somewhere nobody knew her story. Everyone had opinions about what she should do, where she should go, how she should grieve. Owen stayed in the background, helping Mrs. Templeton set out food and making sure people had coffee. He noticed how Ophelia's shoulders grew tighter with each conversation, how her smile became more strained, how her eyes darted toward the door like she was calculating an escape route, even in her own home. When Tucker cornered her about the mine, raising his voice about contracts and obligations, Owen stepped in smoothly. "Excuse me, Mr. Tucker," Owen said, his tone polite but firm. "I believe Mrs. Preston has had enough business talk for one day. Maybe you could come by the bank tomorrow when she's had time to rest." Tucker glared at him, ready to argue, but something in Owen's stance made him reconsider. Owen wasn't a big man, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced down stampeding cattle and mountain lions and lived to tell about it. Tucker grunted and walked away, leaving Ophelia staring at Owen with something like wonder in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I couldn't seem to make my voice work." "You've had a long few days," Owen said gently. "Nobody expects you to handle everything all at once, don't they?" Ophelia looked around the room at all the people drinking Silas's whiskey and eating food she'd prepared, talking about her future like she wasn't even there. It seems like everyone has expectations. Owen wanted to tell her she didn't owe anyone anything, but this wasn't the time or place. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Let me know if you need anyone else redirected. I'm pretty good at interrupting conversations." For the first time since the gunshot, Ophelia felt something close to a smile try to form on her lips. It didn't quite make it, but the attempt was there. "I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Calloway." The gathering finally ended as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ophelia closed the door behind the last guest and leaned against it, exhausted beyond measure. The house was a mess of dirty dishes and empty glasses, but she couldn't bring herself to clean. Instead, she walked upstairs to the bedroom she'd shared with Silas and started pulling his clothes from the wardrobe. She carried them downstairs and out to the yard, then went back for more. Shirts and trousers and boots and belts, everything that had ever touched his skin. She piled it all in the fire pit and stood there looking at it until full dark fell. Owen had gone back to the boarding house, but he couldn't settle. He sat on the porch smoking a cigarette he'd rolled himself, watching the lights of Florissant flicker on one by one. He could see the Preston house on the hill, could see a small fire burning in the yard. He knew what she was doing. He'd burned things himself after his father died, not out of hatred but out of need, the need to purge and start fresh. But his father had been a good man, tough but fair, nothing like Silas Preston. The next morning, Ophelia went to the bank as everyone had insisted she must. Mr. Whitmore sat her down in his office and went through everything. The mine shares, the house deed, 3 different bank accounts, investments in a Denver hotel and a freight company. Silas had been worth more than she'd realized, and now it was all hers. The numbers made her head spin. She'd grown up poor, survived poorer, and now she was wealthy enough to do anything she wanted. Except she had no idea what she wanted anymore. "You'll need to think about management of the mine," Mr. Whitmore said, peering at her over his spectacles. "Tucker can continue as foreman if you like, or you might consider selling your shares. There are several interested parties. I'll need time to think, Ophelia said. Everything felt overwhelming, like standing at the base of a mountain and being told to climb. Of course, Whitmore said, though his tone suggested he thought she should decide immediately. There's also the matter of the house. It's far too large for a woman alone. You might consider selling it as well, moving into something more modest in town. Ophelia felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sudden. Everyone wanted to tell her what to do, wanted to manage her life as if she were a child or an imbecile. "The house is mine," she said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "I'll decide what to do with it when I'm ready." Whitmore blinked, clearly taken aback by her tone. "Yes, well, certainly. I only meant to be helpful." "I know what you meant," Ophelia said, standing up. "Thank you for the information. I'll be in touch when I've made decisions." She walked out before he could say anything else, her heart pounding. She'd never spoken to anyone like that before, had never dared. It felt terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She nearly collided with Owen on the boardwalk outside the bank. He caught her elbow to steady her, then immediately released it as if he'd touched something hot. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Preston. Are you all right?" Ophelia realized she was breathing hard, her hands clenched into fists. "I just told Mr. Whitmore to stop telling me what to do with my own property." Owen's expression shifted into something that might have been pride. "Good for you." "Is it?" Ophelia looked up at him, genuinely uncertain. "I feel like I'm supposed to be grateful for everyone's advice. I feel like I'm supposed to be helpless." "You're supposed to be yourself," Owen said. "And from what I've seen, that's a woman who's plenty capable of making her own decisions." He paused, then added, "I'm heading over to the general store if you need company, or if you'd rather be alone, I understand that too." Ophelia surprised herself by saying, "Company would be nice." They walked together down the street, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt like she could breathe properly. Owen didn't try to fill the silence with chatter or advice. He just walked beside her, his presence solid and calm, and let her be. At the general store, Ophelia bought fabric for new curtains and Owen picked up ammunition and coffee. They talked about small things, safe things. The weather turning cooler as September approached, the aspen trees that would soon turn gold, the quality of this year's hay crop. Owen told her about his ranch, how he'd built it from nothing over the past 6 years, how he ran cattle and broke horses and lived alone except for his foreman, an older man named Pete who taught him everything about ranching. "Don't you get lonely?" Ophelia asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too presumptuous, but Owen just shrugged. "Sometimes, but there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I'm alone by choice, which makes it bearable." He glanced at her. "I imagine you've been lonely even when you weren't alone." Ophelia felt tears sting her eyes. Nobody had understood that, not in 5 years. Everyone had seen the big house and the nice clothes and assumed she was fortunate. Nobody had seen the loneliness that came with living beside someone who looked at you like property instead of a person. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly right." They walked back to her house together, Owen carrying her packages. At the gate, he handed them to her and said, "I'll be in town a few more days if you need anything. After that, I'll be at my ranch, but I come to Florissant once a month for supplies. Mrs. Templeton knows how to reach me if something urgent comes up." Ophelia wanted to ask him to stay longer, wanted to ask him not to leave at all, but she had no right to ask anything of him. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway, for everything." "Owen," he said. "You can call me Owen." "Owen," she repeated, and the name felt comfortable in her mouth. "I'm Ophelia." "I know," he said, and smiled at her before walking away. Ophelia watched him go, her packages clutched to her chest, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what to call it. Hope. Over the next 3 days, Owen found reasons to stay in Florissant. He helped Mrs. Templeton repair her chicken coop, volunteered to fix a loose wheel on the doctor's buggy, even played cards at the saloon with some of the miners, though he was careful to play poorly enough to lose a little money and make friends. Each day, he saw Ophelia around town, and each day they talked a little longer. She was starting to relax around him, starting to smile more easily, though there was still a wariness in her eyes that broke his heart. On the 4th day, Tucker showed up at Ophelia's house drunk and demanding she sign papers keeping him on as foreman at his current salary. Ophelia told him to come back when he was sober and she'd consider it. Tucker grabbed her arm, said she didn't understand how the mining business worked, said she needed him whether she liked it or not. Ophelia tried to pull away, panic flooding through her because this was how it had always started with Sela's, the grabbing and the yelling, and then worse. Owen had been walking past on his way to the livery stable when he heard Tucker's raised voice. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He walked through the open gate and up the porch steps and said, "Let go of her, now." Tucker spun around, still gripping Ophelia's arm. "This isn't your business, Calloway." "You're making it my business," Owen said, his voice deadly calm. "Let go of her, or I'll make you let go." Tucker was bigger than Owen and mean with alcohol, but something in Owen's eyes made him release Ophelia's arm. "She needs to understand how things work," Tucker muttered. "She understands just fine," Owen said. "What you need to understand is that if you ever touch her again, you'll answer to me, and I promise you won't like how that conversation goes." He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The threat was clear enough. Tucker left, cursing under his breath, and Ophelia sank down onto the porch steps, shaking. Owen sat beside her, careful to keep some distance between them, not wanting to make her feel crowded. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," Ophelia said honestly. "But I'm grateful you came by." She looked at him, this man who kept appearing when she needed help, who never asked for anything in return. "Why are you still in town, Owen? Your supplies were bought days ago." Owen had known this question was coming, had been preparing an answer, but now that she'd asked, he found he couldn't lie to her. "Because I wanted to make sure you were all right. Because I've been watching you struggle and I wanted to be here if you needed someone." He paused, then added, "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the first moment I saw you standing on that porch." Ophelia's breath caught. "Owen, I'm a widow. My husband has been dead less than a week. People will talk." "Let them talk," Owen said. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm just telling you the truth. You deserve the truth." He stood up, put his hat back on. "I'll leave for the ranch tomorrow, but I meant what I said about coming back once a month, and if you need me before then, send word. I'll come." That night, Ophelia lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Owen Calloway. She thought about his kind eyes and gentle voice, about the way he'd defended her twice now without making her feel weak for needing defense. She thought about what it might be like to know a man who didn't hurt, who didn't control, who simply offered support and then stepped back to let her choose. It felt impossible, like a fairy tale someone might tell children before bed. But when she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of riding horses across open grassland, of mountains in the distance and wind in her hair, and in the dream, she wasn't afraid at all. Owen left the next morning before dawn, riding south toward Colorado Springs with a heart that felt heavier than it should. He told himself not to care too much, not to hope too much, but it was too late for that. He cared about Ophelia Preston more than he'd cared about any woman in his life, and she was still locked in a prison even though the bars were gone. She was locked by propriety and grief, and 5 years of learned fear. He'd have to be patient, would have to give her time to heal, would have to hope that eventually she'd see him as something other than just another man making demands. The ranch was as he'd left it, weathered buildings and sturdy corrals set in a valley with good water and better grass. Pete had kept everything running smoothly, as Owen had known he would. Pete was 62, had been a cowboy all his life, and had taken a chance on Owen when Owen was barely 20 with more ambition than sense. Now the older man looked up from mending tack and said, "How was Florissant?" "Different than I expected," Owen said, dismounting and unsaddling his horse. He told Pete about Ophelia Preston's death, about the hearing, about Ophelia. He didn't usually talk about personal things, but Pete had a way of listening that made words come easier. "You got feelings for this widow," Pete said. "It wasn't a question." "I do," Owen admitted, "but it's complicated." "Love usually is," Pete said. "Question is whether you're willing to wait for complicated to get simple." Owen thought about that as he worked through the rest of the day, checking on the cattle, inspecting fence lines, doing all the normal ranch work that had always been enough to satisfy him before. Now, it felt different. Now he kept thinking about what it would be like to have someone to come home to, someone to share the sunset with, someone who chose to be there instead of having nowhere else to go. In Florissant, Ophelia was dealing with her own complications. She fired Tucker and hired a new foreman named Samuel Wright, a quiet man with a good reputation who didn't drink and didn't argue when she told him how she wanted things run. She sold Silas's shares in the Denver hotel because she didn't want anything to do with a business Silas had touched. She kept the mine shares because the miners needed work and she felt responsible for them. She had new locks installed on every door of the house, even though Silas was dead and couldn't hurt her anymore. The locks made her feel safer anyway. September turned into October, and the aspen trees blazed gold against the evergreen forest. Ophelia started taking long walks in the hills, relearning what it felt like to move through the world without fear. She talked to people in town, slowly making friends instead of acquaintances. Mrs. Templeton invited her to join the ladies' sewing circle, and though Ophelia had never been much for sewing, she went because the company was nice and nobody treated her like she was broken. When the 1st of October arrived, Ophelia found herself watching the road from Denver, looking for a rider on a chestnut mare. Owen had said he came to town once a month for supplies, and surely it had been a month now. Surely he'd be coming. But the day passed with no sign of him, and Ophelia felt foolish for watching, for hoping. He'd probably forgotten all about her, had probably just been kind out of pity or duty, or because that's what decent men did. Owen arrived on October 2nd because he'd forced himself to wait an extra day, not wanting to seem too eager, though every instinct had been screaming at him to leave the day before. He rode into Florissant in the afternoon and went straight to the general store for supplies he mostly didn't need. Mrs. Yates, who ran the store, smiled at him knowingly and said, "If you're looking for Mrs. Preston, I saw her heading toward the church about an hour ago." Owen felt his face heat up, but didn't bother denying it. He paid for his supplies, left them to be picked up later, and walked toward the small white church at the edge of town. He found Ophelia in the graveyard, but she wasn't at Silas's grave. She was kneeling in front of two markers side by side, older graves marked simply Mother and Father with dates from 5 years ago. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her, but she heard him anyway. She looked up and her face transformed when she saw him, a smile breaking across it like sunrise. "Owen," she said, and his name in her voice sounded like music. "You came back." "I said I would," Owen replied, helping her to her feet. "I always keep my word." They walked together through town, talking about everything and nothing. Ophelia told him about firing Tucker and hiring Samuel, about selling the hotel shares, about learning to run a business she'd never wanted. Owen told her about the ranch, about breaking a particularly stubborn Mustang, about Pete's insistence on making sourdough pancakes every morning, even though they never turned out quite right. They had dinner at the boarding house with Mrs. Templeton hovering happily over them, clearly playing matchmaker even though propriety dictated they should still be in mourning. "People are going to talk," Ophelia said as they walked back toward her house in the twilight. "Let them," Owen said, echoing what he'd said before. "You've spent 5 years living for other people's opinions. Maybe it's time to live for your own." Ophelia stopped walking and looked up at him. The evening light turned everything soft and golden, made the world feel like it might be full of possibilities instead of just rules and restrictions. "What if I don't know what I want?" "Then you take time to figure it out," Owen said gently. "There's no rush. Life doesn't have to be decided all at once." But Ophelia was tired of not knowing, tired of being afraid to reach for what she wanted. "I know I want to see you again," she said. "More than once a month, I know that much." Owen's heart felt like it might burst out of his chest. "I'd like that too. I could come every other week, or I could write letters in between, or you could come visit the ranch if you wanted to see what my life is like." He paused. "Whatever you're comfortable with. Letters," Ophelia decided, "and visits every other week, and maybe the ranch eventually when I'm ready." She smiled at him, and this time it reached her eyes, made them shine like creek water in sunlight. "Is that asking too much?" "No, madam," Owen said, grinning back at her. "That's asking exactly the right amount." He stayed 2 days this time, helping her with repairs around the house that were too big for her to handle alone. He fixed the sagging porch step, replaced some rotting boards in the barn, even climbed up on the roof to patch a leak she'd been worrying about. They worked side by side, and Ophelia found herself laughing at his stories, found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't known were possible. Owen never touched her except accidentally, never crowded her, never made her feel like he expected anything. He was just there, steady and patient and kind. When he left, Ophelia stood on the porch waving until he disappeared around the bend in the road. Then she went inside and started writing him a letter, words spilling onto paper faster than she could think them through. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the wagon train west, about her parents and how much she'd loved them. She told him about the loneliness of the past 5 years, about learning to disappear inside herself, about surviving day by day, and sometimes hour by hour. She didn't tell him everything, couldn't quite bring herself to describe the worst of what Silas had done, but she told him enough that he'd understand why she was cautious, why trust was hard for her. Owen's letter arrived a week later, delivered by the regular mail coach from Colorado Springs. He wrote about his own childhood in Missouri, the strange coincidence that they'd both come from the same state. His parents had homesteaded in Colorado when he was 12, drawn by promises of free land and fresh starts. His mother had died when he was 16, his father when he was 20, and he'd taken the small farm they'd built and turned it into a working ranch through sheer determination and long hours. He wrote about loneliness too, about choosing solitude because it felt safer than risking his heart on the wrong person. But then he wrote about seeing her on that porch the day Silas died, and how something had shifted inside him, how he'd known immediately that she was someone worth risking everything for. Ophelia read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her bedside table. She wrote back that same evening, and so began a correspondence that sustained them both through the long weeks between visits. They wrote about their days, their hopes, their fears. Owen wrote about wanting to expand the ranch, maybe buy the property to the north, maybe breed better horses. Ophelia wrote about wanting to travel someday, to see Denver and maybe even San Francisco, to visit places Silas would never have let her go. They wrote about books they'd read and songs they remembered and childhood memories that felt safe to share. The visits every other week became the highlights of both their lives. October faded into November, and the first snow dusted the peaks around Florissant. Owen taught Ophelia to ride properly, not the careful side-saddle trot Silas had required, but real riding, astride and free. They rode through the forests and meadows, and Ophelia felt like she was reclaiming parts of herself she'd thought were lost forever. Owen showed her how to handle a rifle properly, how to shoot straight and clean the weapon afterward. He never asked why she wanted to learn, but she knew he understood. She wanted to be able to defend herself, wanted to never feel helpless again. By December, they were holding hands when they walked through town, and the gossip had shifted from scandalous to romantic. People were starting to see them as a couple, starting to ask when there might be a wedding. Ophelia tensed up every time someone mentioned marriage, and Owen always deflected smoothly, changing the subject without making it obvious. He knew she needed more time, knew the word wife probably still tasted like poison in her mouth. Christmas came and Ophelia invited Owen to spend it at her house. They decorated with pine boughs and holly berries, and she cooked a proper Christmas dinner with roasted chicken and all the trimmings. Pete came too, and Mrs. Templeton, and it felt like family in a way that made Ophelia's heart ache with both joy and grief for all the years she'd missed feeling this way. They sang carols and told stories and laughed until their sides hurt. And when Owen looked at her across the table with such warmth in his eyes, Ophelia felt herself falling deeper into love with him. That night, after everyone else had gone home, Owen and Ophelia sat by the fire and he finally took her hand properly, not just for a moment but holding it, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I love you," he said quietly. "I know it might be too soon to say it, but I need you to know. I love you and I'll wait as long as you need me to wait." Ophelia felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was afraid I'd never feel this way about anyone. I was afraid Silas had broken that part of me." "You're not broken," Owen said fiercely. "You're strong and brave and beautiful, and what happened to you wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault." She kissed him then, leaning forward and pressing her lips to his, tentative at first and then more sure when he responded gently, letting her control the pace, letting her decide how much and how fast. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers and said, "Marry me. Not today or tomorrow or even next month. But someday when you're ready, marry me and come live at the ranch and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Ophelia wanted to say yes immediately, but fear still had its claws in her. "What if I can't be a good wife? What if I'm too damaged?" "You're not damaged," Owen repeated. "And even if you were, I'd love you anyway. Love doesn't require perfection, Ophelia. It just requires truth and trust and trying." He pulled back to look at her properly. "Think about it. No pressure, no timeline. Just know that I'm asking and I'll keep asking until you believe you deserve to be happy." That night, after Owen left for the boarding house because propriety still had to be observed to some degree, Ophelia lay in bed and let herself imagine a future. She imagined waking up next to Owen every morning, imagined running a ranch together, imagined children who'd never know fear in their own home. The imagining didn't hurt the way she'd expected. Instead, it felt like hope taking root, like spring bulbs pushing through frozen ground. January 1879 arrived cold and clear. Ophelia made a decision. She went to Mr. Whitmore at the bank and told him she wanted to sell the house on the hill. The mine shares she'd keep, or rather she'd put them in trust for the miners, making them partial owners in their own labor. The money from the house sale she'd keep for herself, independence earned through survival. Whitmore looked shocked, but agreed to handle the arrangements. When Owen arrived for his next visit in mid-January, Ophelia met him at the edge of town on horseback, wearing the split riding skirt she'd sewn herself, and carrying saddlebags packed with clothes and books and all her letters from him. "I sold the house," she told him, her breath making clouds in the frozen air. "Or I will as soon as the paperwork clears. I thought maybe I could come see your ranch now, stay for a while, see if I like it." Owen's face split into the widest grin she'd ever seen. "You thought maybe? That sounds like you already decided." "Maybe I did," Ophelia said, feeling bold and terrified and gloriously free all at once. "Maybe I decided I'm tired of being afraid. Maybe I decided I want to be happy more than I want to be safe." "You can be both," Owen promised, bringing his horse alongside hers. "With me, you get to be both." They rode south together, leaving Florissant behind and heading toward Colorado Springs and the ranch beyond. The journey took 2 days, and they stayed at a respectable hotel in Colorado Springs, where Owen got separate rooms and didn't even complain about it, because he understood she still needed that boundary, still needed to know she was choosing everything that happened between them. The ranch looked like something from a dream when they finally arrived, a valley with a creek running through it and mountains standing guard all around. The house was smaller than what Ophelia was used to, but it was built solid with good wood and careful hands. Pete came out to greet them, taking one look at Ophelia and breaking into a smile that crinkled his weathered face. "So you're the woman who's got Owen writing poetry in his spare time," he said. "I don't write poetry," Owen protested, his ears turning red. "You tried to," Pete said. "It was terrible, but the trying counted." He winked at Ophelia. "Welcome to the ranch, miss. It's about time this place had a woman's touch again." Ophelia spent the next week learning the ranch, learning how to feed chickens and gather eggs, how to help with the horses, how to cook on the big cast iron stove in the kitchen. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings and hard work, and simple satisfaction of falling into bed exhausted at the end of the day. She learned what it felt like to work beside Owen, to share goals and dreams and daily tasks. She learned what partnership could mean when both people were pulling in the same direction. At night, they sat by the fire and talked about the future. Owen wanted to hear her ideas about the ranch, wanted her input on decisions, treated her like an equal partner, even though they weren't married yet. Ophelia suggested they could breed horses specifically for mountain work, sure-footed animals that could handle the steep trails and thin air. Owen thought that was brilliant and immediately started planning how they'd implement it. They talked about building a bigger barn, about adding sheep to the cattle operation, about 100 different possibilities that all started with "we" instead of "I." February brought a thaw, and with it, a letter from Mr. Whitmore saying the house had sold for a good price and the money was waiting in Ophelia's account. She was officially untethered from Florissant, from Sela's, from everything that had held her prisoner. She stood on the porch of Owen's ranch house holding that letter and felt the last chains fall away. That evening, she found Owen in the barn checking on a mare about to foal. "Ask me again," she said without preamble. Owen looked up from examining the mare's swollen belly, confusion clear on his face. "Ask you what?" "What you asked me at Christmas," Ophelia said, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Ask me again." Understanding dawned on Owen's face, followed by such joy it made Ophelia's breath catch. He stood up slowly, brushing hay off his trousers, and walked over to her. He took both her hands in his, looked her straight in the eye and said, "Ophelia Preston, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner? Will you build this ranch and this life with me? Will you let me love you for the rest of our days?" "Yes," Ophelia said, and the word felt like flying. Yes to all of it. Yes to everything. Owen kissed her right there in the barn with the horses watching and the smell of hay all around them. Kissed her like she was precious and essential and exactly where she belonged. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time, and the mare nickered softly as if offering her own congratulations. They got married in March in Colorado Springs at the small church on Pine Street. Pete stood up for Owen, and Mrs. Templeton came down from Florissant to stand up for Ophelia. The ceremony was simple and quick, just the vows and rings and a kiss that sealed a promise both of them intended to keep. Ophelia wore a dress the color of spring sky, not white because white felt like a lie, not black because she was done with mourning. She wore blue and felt beautiful, felt like herself in a way she'd never felt wearing the clothes Silas had chosen for her. The first night as husband and wife, Owen carried her over the threshold of the ranch house even though she laughingly protested she could walk just fine. He set her down gently in the bedroom and then just stood there looking at her, wonder written all over his face. "I still can't believe you're here," he said. "I still can't believe you chose me." "I'll keep choosing you every day," Ophelia promised. "That's what love is, isn't it? Choosing each other over and over again." Owen proved to be as gentle and patient in their marriage bed as he'd been in courtship. He took his time, made sure she felt safe and cherished, never pushed when she got nervous. Ophelia discovered that intimacy didn't have to hurt, that her body could feel pleasure instead of pain, that trust could turn fear into something beautiful. They learned each other slowly, night by night, building new memories to replace the ones Silas had left behind. Spring turned the valley green and filled the creek with snowmelt. Ophelia threw herself into ranch work, discovering she was good at it, discovering she loved the physical labor and the tangible results. She started a kitchen garden, planting vegetables and herbs that would feed them through the summer. She began working with the horses, finding she had a natural way with them, able to calm even the most skittish animals. Owen watched her bloom like the wildflowers in the meadows and felt grateful every single day for the chance to love her. In May, Samuel Wright sent word from Florissant that the mine was doing well, and the profit-sharing system Ophelia had set up was making the miners loyal and productive. He included a check for her portion, which she promptly used to buy 3 breeding mares Owen had been wanting. When the horses arrived, Owen shook his head in amazement and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Ophelia said. "This is our ranch now, our dream. What's mine is yours." "And what's mine is yours," Owen replied, pulling her close. "Everything I have, everything I am, all of it is yours." By July, Ophelia realized she was pregnant. She'd missed 2 monthly courses and her breasts were tender and she felt queasy every morning. Fear gripped her initially because pregnancy had always been something she'd dreaded with Silas. The thought of being tied to him even more permanently, the thought of bringing a child into that house of misery. But this was different. This was Owen's child, conceived in love instead of obligation, and the thought of holding their baby made her cry with happiness instead of dread. She told Owen that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He went very still, then turned to look at her with such tenderness she knew everything would be all right. "A baby," he said softly. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Ophelia asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Owen said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thrilled, terrified, grateful, all of it at once." He put his hand on her still flat stomach. "Thank you for trusting me with this, with everything." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Ophelia stayed active, working on the ranch as long as she felt able, then gradually shifting to lighter tasks as her belly grew. Owen fussed over her constantly, bringing her water and making sure she rested, insisting Pete take on more of the heavy work so Owen could stay close to the house. Pete grumbled good-naturedly about young people worrying too much, but secretly was just as protective of Ophelia as Owen was. In December, Mrs. Templeton came to stay at the ranch for a month, determined to be there when the baby arrived. She cooked and cleaned and kept Ophelia company through the long winter days when Owen and Pete had to be out tending the stock. She told stories about her own children, grown now and scattered across the West, and taught Ophelia to knit baby clothes from soft wool. Ophelia's hands were clumsy at first, but she persisted, wanting to make something with her own hands for this child who would know only love. The baby came on a cold night in late January 1880, almost 2 years to the day after Silas's death. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Ophelia thought she might break from the pain of it, but Owen stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry, Mrs. Templeton wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in Ophelia's arms. A boy, perfect and healthy, with Owen's dark hair and Ophelia's blue eyes. "Hello, little one," Ophelia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to your life. You're going to be so loved." They named him James Owen Calloway, after Owen's father who taught him to be a good man. James grew fat and happy on his mother's milk, sleeping in a cradle Owen had built with his own hands. Ophelia watched her husband rock their son and felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. This was what family was supposed to feel like, what home was supposed to be. Safe and warm and overflowing with love. The months blurred together in the beautiful chaos of new parenthood. James learned to smile, to laugh, to grab at everything within reach. Ophelia learned to function on little sleep, to nurse while cooking dinner, to love so fiercely it almost scared her. Owen learned to change diapers and walk the floor with a fussy baby, to sing lullabies in his rough cowboy voice, to be gentle in ways he'd never imagined. By summer, James was crawling and getting into everything. Ophelia had to watch him constantly to keep him from eating dirt or chasing chickens. Owen built a fence around the porch so James could play safely while they worked within sight. Pete carved wooden toys for the boy and taught him to laugh at funny faces. The ranch felt complete in a way it never had before, like all the pieces had finally come together. In August, Owen and Ophelia took James to Florissant to visit Mrs. Templeton and show him off to the town. People gathered around cooing over the baby, remarking how much he looked like his father, congratulating Ophelia on motherhood. She stood in the same street where she'd heard the gunshot that freed her, and she felt nothing but gratitude for the strange path that had led her here. Samuel Wright reported the mine was expanding, hiring more workers and producing record amounts of silver. Ophelia signed papers to ensure the profit sharing continued, wanting the miners to benefit from their labor even after she was gone. They visited the cemetery before leaving town. Ophelia laid flowers on her parents' graves and told them about James, about Owen, about the life she'd built from the ashes of the old one. She didn't visit Silas's grave. She had nothing to say to him, nothing he deserved to hear. He was buried and gone, and that was enough. On the ride back to the ranch, with James sleeping in a sling against Ophelia's chest and Owen riding beside her, she felt a sense of peace settle over her like a warm blanket. "I'm happy," she said aloud, testing the words to see if they were true. They were. "I'm actually completely happy." Good, Owen said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. You deserve every bit of happiness this world can offer, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you get it. The years rolled on, each one better than the last. James grew from baby to toddler to boy, running wild on the ranch and learning to ride almost before he could walk properly. When he was 3, Ophelia got pregnant again, and this time a daughter arrived, Emma, named for Owen's mother. Emma had her mother's blonde hair and her father's steady temperament, content to sit for hours watching the world go by. The two children adored each other, James protective of his little sister, Emma following her brother everywhere once she learned to walk. The ranch prospered. Owen's idea to breed mountain horses proved successful, and buyers came from all over Colorado to purchase stock. Ophelia kept the books and handled the business side, discovering she had a head for numbers and negotiations. They bought the property to the north, expanding their grazing land, and hired 2 more hands to help with the work. Pete stayed on, getting older but no less valuable, teaching James to rope and Emma to ride and both children to respect the land they lived on. In 1885, when James was 5 and Emma was 2, Ophelia discovered she was pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder, made her more tired, gave her aches and pains she didn't remember from the others. Owen worried constantly, insisting she rest more, taking over even the light tasks she'd usually handle. When her time came in early 1886, the labor was difficult and frightening. For a while, the midwife wasn't sure if both mother and baby would make it. But Ophelia was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and she fought her way through to deliver another healthy boy, Thomas, red-faced and angry at being born, perfect in every way. No more, Owen said after, holding Thomas and watching Ophelia sleep, exhausted from the ordeal. No more babies. I can't watch you go through that again. When Ophelia woke, he repeated it, and she agreed. 3 children was plenty, more than plenty. They had a family, complete and whole and exactly right. Thomas proved to be the wildest of the 3, into everything, afraid of nothing, keeping both parents on their toes. James appointed himself as guardian of his younger siblings, serious and responsible beyond his years. Emma floated between her brothers, peacemaker and instigator by turns. The house rang with laughter and arguments and the chaotic joy of childhood. Ophelia and Owen moved through it all hand in hand, partners in every sense of the word. On their 10th wedding anniversary in March 1889, Owen took Ophelia on a trip to Denver, leaving the children with Pete and Mrs. Templeton, who'd moved to the ranch permanently after selling her boarding house. In Denver, they stayed at a fancy hotel, ate at restaurants with white tablecloths, went to the opera like proper society people. But what Ophelia loved most was just walking through the city holding Owen's hand, being anonymous and free, being just a couple in love instead of parents and ranchers and all the other roles they played. You ever regret it? Owen asked one night as they lay in the hotel bed, the sounds of the city drifting through the window. Marrying me, leaving everything behind, building this life. Ophelia propped herself up on one elbow to look at him properly. 10 years had put some silver in his dark hair and lines around his eyes, but to her, he was just as handsome as the day she'd first seen him. Not for one single second, she said firmly. You saved my life, Owen, not just by being there that day, but by showing me what love is supposed to be. By giving me a reason to believe in tomorrow. She kissed him softly. I'll love you until I die, and probably after that too. Good, Owen said, pulling her close, because I'm not done loving you yet, not even close. They returned to the ranch renewed, ready to dive back into the beautiful chaos of family life. James was 8 now, old enough to help with real ranch work, and he took to it with enthusiasm. Emma was 5, learning her letters from Ophelia and begging for a kitten of her own. Thomas was 3, a whirlwind of energy who kept everyone laughing with his antics. The house was never quiet, never still, and Ophelia wouldn't have had it any other way. Pete died peacefully in his sleep in the summer of 1891, aged 74 and satisfied with a life well lived. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he'd helped build, with a view of the mountains he'd loved. James cried because Pete had been like a grandfather to him. Emma left wildflowers on the grave every week. Thomas was too young to understand but sensed the sadness and grew quieter for a while. Owen grieved the loss of his mentor and friend, but he was grateful Pete had lived long enough to see the ranch thrive and the family grow. Life continued its forward march. James turned into a teenager, tall and strong and so much like his father, it sometimes made Ophelia's heart ache. Emma proved to have her mother's way with horses, gentle and intuitive, able to calm even the most troubled animal. Thomas settled down slightly as he got older, but remained the ranch's resident troublemaker, always finding new ways to test boundaries and make his parents gray. In 1895, when Ophelia was 35 and Owen was 43, they took another trip, this time to San Francisco, a dream Ophelia had mentioned in one of those early letters. They rode the train across the mountains and desert, through country both beautiful and harsh, and arrived in the city by the bay with eyes wide as children. They saw the ocean for the first time, vast and overwhelming and wonderful. They walked the steep streets and ate Chinese food and rode the cable cars. They spent a week being tourists and adventurers, and then they went home because home was where they wanted to be. The children grew and changed. James fell in love with a girl from Colorado Springs, the daughter of a doctor, and married her when he was 21. They built a house on the edge of the ranch property and started their own family, making Ophelia and Owen into grandparents far sooner than they'd expected, but with just as much joy. Emma declared she'd never marry, that she was going to breed horses and be independent forever, though Ophelia suspected that stance might change when the right person came along. Thomas talked about becoming a lawyer, about moving to Denver and making his mark on the world, though Owen secretly hoped he'd change his mind and stay on the ranch. By 1900, Ophelia was 40 years old and Owen was 48. They'd been married for 21 years, together for 22, and Ophelia could barely remember the frightened woman she'd been in Florissant. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd read about in a book rather than been. She'd grown into herself on this ranch, had become strong and confident and genuinely happy. The scars Sela's left never fully disappeared, but they'd faded to pale reminders instead of open wounds. Sometimes she had nightmares still, woke up gasping and afraid until Owen pulled her close and reminded her where she was, who she was, that she was safe. But those nights were rare now, growing rarer with each passing year. They sat on the porch one evening in late summer, watching the sun set behind the mountains, their hands intertwined the way they'd been for more than 2 decades. James and his wife were having dinner with them tomorrow. Emma was in the barn working with a new foal. Thomas was away at university in Denver, studying law after all and writing letters home that suggested he might actually enjoy it. The ranch was quiet in the golden hour before dark, peaceful in a way that made Ophelia's soul settle. "You remember the first time we met?" Owen asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Of course," Ophelia said. "I was standing on the porch of the general store and you were on your horse looking at me like you wanted to help but weren't sure how. I fell in love with you that day," Owen admitted. Took one look at you and knew my life was about to change. He turned to face her. Best change that ever happened to me. You waited, Ophelia said, something she'd thought about often over the years. You waited for me to be free to love you back. Not just legally free, but really free in my heart and mind. That's the greatest gift anyone ever gave me. You were worth waiting for, Owen said simply. You're worth everything. They sat in silence as the stars came out, as the familiar sounds of the ranch settled around them. Somewhere in the barn, Emma was singing to the horses. In the distance, cattle lowed and the creek babbled over rocks. An owl hooted from the pine trees and the first cool breeze of evening whispered across the valley. This was home. This was family. This was the life they'd built together from courage and patience and love that waited until waiting was done. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. James's family grew to include 3 children of their own. 2 boys and a girl who loved visiting their grandparents and learning the same skills their father had learned. Emma surprised everyone by falling in love with a traveling horse trader when she was 25, marrying him in a simple ceremony on the ranch and continuing to breed horses with him as her partner. Thomas became a lawyer in Denver, but came home for every holiday and most summers, bringing with him eventually a wife who was also a lawyer and shared his passion for justice. Ophelia and Owen grew older together, silver threads turning into silver hair, lines deepening into well-worn maps of lives fully lived. They slowed down some but never stopped, still working the ranch though they hired more help, still riding through the meadows though not as fast or as far. They celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th, marking each year as a victory over the darkness that could have consumed Ophelia if Owen hadn't been there to offer light. On a spring morning in 1909, Ophelia woke before dawn and looked at Owen sleeping beside her. He was 67 now, his face weathered by sun and wind and time, but still handsome to her eyes, still the man who'd saved her simply by being patient and kind. She thought about the girl she'd been, trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape, certain she'd never be happy. She thought about Owen waiting, watching, refusing to push or demand, just offering steady support until she was ready to reach for it. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked sleepily, his eyes opening to find her watching him. "That I'm grateful," Ophelia said. "For every single day of the past 31 years, for you waiting, for me finding courage, for this life we built together." Owen pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "I'd wait another 31 years if I had to. I'd wait forever for you, but there was no more waiting now." They'd lived their waiting, endured their trials, earned their happiness through patience and work, and refusing to give up on each other or themselves. They had children and grandchildren who knew only love in their homes. They had a ranch that prospered through good management and hard work. They had each other, which was and always had been enough. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink, Ophelia and Owen got up to start another day. Another day of working side by side, of stolen kisses in the barn, of laughter over breakfast, of all the small and large moments that made up a well-lived life. The cowboy had waited until she was free to love him, and she'd taken that freedom and woven it into something beautiful, something lasting, something real. They walked out onto the porch hand in hand, coffee cups steaming in the cool morning air, and looked at the ranch spread out before them like a promise kept. This was their legacy, not just land and buildings and livestock, but love that had survived darkness and emerged stronger. Love that had waited when waiting was needed and flourished when freedom came. Love that would echo through the generations of the family they'd created, teaching their children's children that patience and kindness were the truest forms of strength. "I love you," Ophelia said, the words as fresh and meaningful as the first time she'd spoken them more than 3 decades ago. "I love you too," Owen replied, pulling her closer. "Today and always." And in the morning light, with the mountains standing witness and the land stretching out before them, they began another day together, another chapter in a love story that had started with a gunshot and a decision to wait, to hope, to believe that freedom and love were worth fighting for. They'd fought that fight and won it, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the steady accumulation of days spent choosing each other, trusting each other, building a life that honored both their struggles and their triumphs. The wild west of their youth was slowly fading, giving way to automobiles and telephones, and the 20th century's march toward modernity. But on their ranch in the Colorado Valley, the values remained timeless. Hard work, loyalty, family, and above all, love freely given between two people who'd found each other when they both needed saving. Owen had waited until Ophelia was free to love, and that waiting had made their love all the sweeter, all the stronger, all the more precious for having been earned through patience rather than seized through impatience. Their story would be told for generations, a tale of the cowboy and the trapped woman, of waiting and freedom, of darkness overcome by steady, patient light. Their grandchildren would sit on this same porch and hear how Grandma Ophelia had survived what seemed unsurvivable, how Grandpa Owen had waited with a patience born of true love, how together they'd built not just a ranch but a legacy of hope. And those grandchildren would learn that love worth having is love worth waiting for, that freedom is sometimes a gift we give ourselves and sometimes a gift others help us claim, that happy endings are real when two people are brave enough and patient enough to build them together, day by day, choice by choice, forever and always, until death and beyond, true and lasting and completely, beautifully whole.